Let me quote a line from your Defence Secretary, Jim Mattis. He said recently, General Mattis said recently, "In a globalised world, there are many belts and many roads, and no one nation should put itself into a position of dictating one belt, one road." Now that's a great line, but doesn't it betray a certain defensiveness on the part of Washington about the Belt and Road Initiative? And how can the United States compete with the rivers of state capital that China can deploy? Isn't the United States rightly nervous that this will be another factor that plays to the advantage of the Chinese and the disadvantage of the United States?
Well, I subscribe to the sentiment behind what the Secretary said, and hopefully tomorrow when we release our new military strategy, which follows the national security strategy that was released a couple of weeks ago, not this issue in a direct and a specific way, but in a general way would be addressed further. There are obviously multiple ideas. I think the Secretary listed them. We need to be serious about pushing for implementation of those. Now, there are some disadvantages that we have, but we need to overcome them. One is that in the case of the One Belt, One Road, it's one country, state dominant, that's pushing it with a great deal of resources behind it. It may be exaggerated, but nevertheless, even if you take some of the more conservative estimates, significant level of effort, much bigger than the Marshall Plan that you, for example, referred to, both in terms of resources and in terms of populations affected and what have you. And the other efforts sometimes are multilateral, and the state is not as influential in financing. Often there is an effort to get the private sector to do it, which is all very good, but we need to be serious to do so. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, the Deputy Minister was talking about, we've had this idea of Afghanistan as a bridge, then Afghanistan as a new Silk Road part of, then Afghanistan and an Asian roundabout. We have had these different ideas, but in terms of actually practical things, we've done some, but we could have done a lot more. And we should not stand for discrimination in terms of values that for example, the north-south corridor that China is creating in Pakistan is okay, but an east-west corridor that connects India with Afghanistan and Central Asia direct is not, and therefore you have to, not that I'm against this project that the Deputy Minister was talking about, the more the better in my judgment. But we need to be serious, we need to address this state-centric as a strength, but has its weaknesses too. So, but nevertheless, we need to address the approach. But to be concerned is the first thing. You need to start with that. That we need to. There is negative aspects to this effort that is part of perhaps a broader effort to establish a new order. That all roads, to borrow from the Secretary, lead to Beijing. That was a good concept of an empire, that one of the long-lasting empires in world history. That's not in anyone's interest for that sort of concept to be realized.
So maybe I'll take a slightly different approach, just to put a couple of additional perspectives on the table, and that is that clearly, China's mobilizing a great amount of state capital to address the infrastructure gap that exists across the Asia Pacific. But the billions or maybe even up to $1 trillion that may be mobilized through state capital pales in comparison to the need that's out there, which has been characterized by the ADB as being somewhere in the range of 26 trillion or 1.7 trillion per year to try to fuel the growth ambitions of Asian economies. And if you think about the capital that resides in the private sector, in the capital markets, you're talking about trillions of dollars of assets that can be deployed. And I was at the Milken Global Institute conference in 2017, where I was listening to pension fund administrators and managers and hedge fund managers all talking about the opportunities in emerging markets and frontier markets, and how do you deal with on the one hand, mitigating the risk, the political risks and the economic risks, and on the other hand, trying to mobilize that capital into the places where it is most needed. So I think to focus too much on the state capital, which is playing a very important role, particularly when you start talking about some of the infrastructure projects, but to think about how you use public finance to leverage the private capital. And then secondly, when you build that infrastructure, connectivity is more than just infrastructure. It's actually about the flow of goods. It's about, creating that economic activity. And again, that's not going to be done through the nation state. That's going to be done through the private sectors. It's going to be done through the people-to-people and the business-to-business exchanges. So I wouldn't put too fine a point on framing this around whether this is about one belt, one road, or something a bit broader and more inclusive, because by its very nature, it's going to have to be broader and more inclusive to meet the real ambitions of the peoples that are being connected.